Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome back to my webinar series, Ditching Diet Culture. Tonight we have episode 3. So this episode will be all about building strategies and habits to kind of accompany some of the things we've talked about in previous episodes. Let's see, we're going to get started in just one moment. All right. So thank you guys again for joining me. If you are joining for the first time, welcome. If you're returning for week 3, welcome back. I'm really excited to be presenting another episode. A few quick housekeeping things just before we get started. If you've signed up for this series, if you have registered with the Zoom link, you're already set up for the next couple episodes. So if you signed up for episode 1, you should be registered all the way through episode 4. And if you signed up for episode 3, again, you'll be registered for episode 4. So no need to go back and redo that. This broadcast will also be recorded. So I'm happy to send out a copy to anybody who would like it after I'm finished with it. If you want to send it to friends, colleagues, or if you didn't get a chance to watch in today, then I'll have this recorded for you. And then just like last week's and the week prior, it'll be about a 30-minute presentation, and then I'll save the last 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you have questions, save them for the end. We'll get to that. We'll have some discussion time at the end. And then last, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Riley Peterson. I am a consultant, registered dietitian. I own my own private practice, Balanced Life Nutrition Consulting. And I am hosting the series because I feel really strongly that reframing the diet culture mindset is essential for success in achieving health and nutrition goals. Ultimately, it's the foundation of my nutrition philosophy. I care deeply about it, what I use in my kind of private practice as well. And so that's kind of why I'm doing this series. Let's get started. There we go. All right, so for episode 3, my webinar objectives are, first, I'm going to, for those of you who didn't get a chance to tune into episodes 1 and 2, I am going to give a brief review, the takeaways, and kind of how it relates to today's episode. I'm going to explain how practicing new mindsets is no different than practicing any other physical skill. And I am going to offer some strategies for building new habits and promoting the shift towards food freedom that I've mentioned in past episodes. I'm going to present the barriers that diet culture may create, because it can be challenging, in practicing these new skills. And last, I'm going to demonstrate how to combat these barriers and create some sustainable change. So, a brief review of episodes 1 and 2. If you're joining for the first time this week, or if you haven't seen the recordings of 1 and 2, I'll go through this. If you have, just bear with me for a moment. So I'll briefly catch you up. In week 1, we discussed the damaging nature of diets. So dieting is this multi-billion-dollar industry that caters directly to the challenges that come up when people are trying to make lifestyle change. You'll hear these red flag phrases such as quick and easy, or melting the fat or the weight away, because quick results are what people are looking for, and they know that. But we talked about why this quick and easy method is a little bit more damaging than it is helpful. You have the risk of falling into this yo-yo diet cycle that can essentially create a higher threshold of fat to try and burn off. Every single time you go through the cycle, it just gets higher and higher. The bar gets higher. And it can also create this irregulation in our metabolic and hormonal regulation, controlling things like hunger and fullness. And loss dieting can inherently introduce this really negative and unhealthy mindset, namely like guilt, restriction, rigidity. Ultimately, these side effects of diet culture are detrimental to the longevity and sustainability of health habits. And then from episode 2, we discussed an alternative for this, food freedom. I define food freedom as a method of achieving your health goals and maintaining a healthy relationship with food without that restriction, guilt, and rigidity I just mentioned. An important framework to guide the balance of eating the foods that you want and still achieving a healthy lifestyle is called intuitive eating. And the tools that we use to intuitively eat are based around a principle called mindful eating. Mindful eating techniques are all centered around the idea of slowing down and eating more intentionally. So paying attention and listening to hunger and fullness, enjoying the time you spend while you're eating, identifying some of those emotional or situational triggers, and being empathetic towards them. Having a little bit more room for forgiveness, rather than feeling that guilt and that shame, etc. So, in practicing these tools, you can achieve more balance and diet in your diet and lifestyle. So when I say to make this shift, this is why I'm asking you to make this shift, because ultimately it can create a more balanced lifestyle for you. Ultimately, you have this scenario in which is presenting a lifelong solution over a quick and a temporary fix. And it's really promoting the mindset of flexibility and forgiveness and sustainability over restriction, guilt, and rigidity. Ultimately, this is all a practice. I mean, I've said this in past episodes, and I'm going to continue to say it until the end of time. This is a practice. Excuse me. Just like any skill, you can practice this food freedom mindset and excel and become more proficient in it over time. This skill does not happen overnight. So I like to think about it if it was compared to learning a sport. You know, if you're trying volleyball for the first time, or you're learning how to knit, or you are learning a new technique of cooking, learning how to ski for the first time. All of these skills are never, ever, no one is ever going to start them on day one and just excel at them. When you think about it, when you first start a new skill, you first kind of start by getting the idea of it. You know, in a sport, you learn the rules. You learn the intention of the game. How do you win? How do you lose? You know, you learn all of the like the etiquette. You learn the kind of framework of the skill of the sport. And then you start to practice. And at first it's awkward and you're clumsy and it's just not the most elegant. But then you start to practice and you start to get stronger in those skills. You build muscle, you build memory. And it starts to get easier every day, every week. Sometimes you hit plateaus where you're not doing so well. Sometimes it gets frustrating. But ultimately, when you stick with them and you practice them over time, you become better. And then you get to a point where you can excel in this skill and your personality comes out and that personal touch, you know, that feeling of natural kind of flow. Suddenly you barely have to think about doing the skill anymore because you know it so well. And ultimately, I claim that is the exact same thing as a mindset. You can follow that exact same pattern in achieving successful results in a new mindset. There's no difference at all. But I do think there is some maybe misconception or a physical skill and a mental skill aren't always equated to be the same. I think people get more discouraged with these mental skills or these mindset shifts because they're not as tangible. You don't see the results as easily. But that's why we're going to be mindful, and that's why we're going to tune in, because these results are, you know, noticeable if you really are tapping in. And then the last piece of this is practice does not end once you master a skill. The most elite athletes, the smartest individuals who are, you know, using mathematical techniques that are way over my head, you know, they've mastered these skills, but they still practice and they're still learning and they're still dedicating time, because if you don't use it, you lose it. So this is a practice, and eventually you're going to get to a point of mastery and natural flow, but it's never over. You are always engaged. So in today's episode, I'm going to go over a handful of strategies that I think are helpful in really practicing this shift of mindset. Some tools that you can use to practice this so that you can get better at it. So with that being said, strategy number 1, write a list of rules. that's very vague. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by a list of rules? Well, I'm talking about food rules. And if you're thinking, I don't have any food rules, I want you to challenge yourself to think of some rules that you have centered around eating, around how much you eat, about how, when you eat, how often, how when you have rules against eating or to eat. We all have rules, whether we consciously address them every day or not. So for example, when I was dieting and I was doing paleo, I had a lot of rules around food groups that I wasn't allowed to eat because paleo excluded food groups like dairy and grains. When I stopped doing paleo, I still implemented those rules and had a really hard time eating foods that were out of that range, out of that rule range. So I didn't really eat carbs, like even healthier options like brown rice and whole grains. I didn't eat bread. I didn't eat pastas. I barely ate rice or quinoa. That was a rule for me. Same thing with dairy. It took me a long time to introduce dairy again because that was a rule, a no rule for me. Just recently, I noticed that one of my rules that I wasn't even consciously following, but I noticed I was following, was no beverages that had calories. So I was a black coffee, unsweetened tea, water drinker, and pretty much nothing else. Now, these are rules that, took me a while to break, some that I'm still noticing, but these are all food rules for me. What food rules exist for you? And I want you to think a little bit harder about them. Do any of these rules make you feel those negative mindsets, that restriction, guilt, or rigidity? Do any of those rules allow forgiveness and flexibility within their structure? Are some of those rules really useful for you? Or do the rules kind of burden you? I want you to not necessarily create a no-no list. I want you to just create a list that taps you into the rules that maybe you weren't super aware of even. So I want you to really dig deep, think of those rules, and write them down. And then I want you to classify each of those rules. Is this rule benefiting me? Do I find that it's burdensome? Do I find that it's guilt-inducing? Do I find that it's really helpful for me? And for those negative ones, those ones that even you have to question, I want you to create a plan for saying goodbye to them. Ditch those rules. Which brings me into strategy 2. Another ditch. You need to ditch the scale. And this is going to be a controversial one. Whenever I tell people this rule, I get that I don't think that's happening. But let me just hear me out why I think you need to ditch the scale. So back in episode 1, if you listened in, there was a section in which I talked about essentially water weight and how much water can impact our weight on a day-to-day basis. So oftentimes people are looking at the scale and water may be a huge factor in either a lower number or a higher number that you see on the scale. So that's one reason. A lot of the times, the scale doesn't reflect a number that is truly indicative of your health status, of even your true weight status. And yet we focus so heavily on those numbers. Not all of us, I'm not going to make the assumption that all of us obsess over these numbers, but I know after talking to a lot of people and having that point in my life where I did it myself, where I was fixated on the scale. I was under the impression I had to get below a certain number and I had to stay below a certain number. But the scale and paying attention to those numbers is extremely frustrating if you've been there. And like I said, some of it might be water. If you weigh 150 pounds, plus or minus 5 or 10 pounds, might be just water. And so when you hit a day where you're 140 and you're feeling great, and the next day you're back to 150, that's such a frustrating thing. I want you to think of weight as when you go to the doctor's office and you step on a scale, that's one of your vitals. You also get your blood pressure measured, your temperature. Sometimes you get blood drawn and you have biochemical analysis that shows your vitals and your health status. And it's just one small piece of that whole picture of health. There are so many other things that you could look at that are less damaging to the mindset, less frustrating at times. So let me give you a couple suggestions, a couple alternatives that you could pay attention to aside from just weight. You could think about the way you feel. So how are you sleeping? What are your energy levels like? Did you used to get that 2 or 3 o'clock dip in the afternoon? Or do you notice that you're able to power through the day pretty well? How are your clothes fitting? Do you feel like it's easier to get up in the morning? If maybe you had hip pain or knee pain or back pain, are you realizing that maybe that pain is a little bit less severe than it used to be? You know, these are all things that you can pay attention to that might be indicative of weight loss or health status changing, but aren't as frustrating to really like obsess over day in and day out or weekly or monthly or whenever you're going to go step on that scale. I urge you to try and tune into those feelings rather than the numbers. I think they're going to be a bit more motivating over time. Next, we have strategy 3. So this one, the good and the bad. I've kind of touched on this a little bit in previous episodes, but I want to go into this more because oftentimes we label foods as good or bad, black or white, healthy or unhealthy. And I think that's just so wrong. I do. You know, I get all the time as a dietitian, like, oh, you must only eat salads or vegetables or only lean meats. And then when I don't eat healthy, I get, like a playful shame, but a little bit of shame, like, oh, wow, you're eating that. You're a dietitian. I thought you ate healthier than that. And I think that there are good and bad aspects of the foods we traditionally see as healthy or unhealthy. So for example, if you are going to be eating the cleanest diet out there, you feel you need to do that because you think it's good for you. I argue that it's very good for you in, not having excessive caloric intake, in getting the nutrients you need, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, things that are going to keep you healthy long-term. It's going to give you good fiber. It could give you good energy as long as you're not under eating. Those are the good parts of a really clean, healthy diet. But what about the good parts of those unhealthy foods? The satisfaction, the indulgence, the socializing with friends. You don't get that. And so that's what I argue is the bad flip of eating an only healthy diet. And on the other hand, you have the unhealthy diet where you're getting that good piece, the indulgence, the satisfaction, the friends groups where you're all getting together and having big meals or meeting for cocktails or beers. But you may be consuming a bit too many calories, and you might be consuming things higher in saturated fat or sodium or too much alcohol. So there's good and bad to pretty much anything out there. And that means that anything can really fit within your diet as long as you're able to commit to that moderation. The other piece of this too is just the labeling and how it affects your mindset. So when someone says, oh, that's really good for you or really bad for you, just inherently you're going to connect some negativity to those bad foods and some guilt in eating them, even if they're fitting quite well within a healthy diet. So I urge you to either remove the labels of good and bad, unhealthy or healthy entirely, or to really pay attention to assigning both good and bad qualities to pretty much anything. Leave yourself open to that. Next strategy is challenging diet speak, diet talk. This one's going to be hard, especially for people that you're not super comfortable with. Again, addressed this in a previous episode where you get a lot of conversation like, oh, you lost weight, you look great, or, wow, that looks really healthy, you're being so good. So there's these very, I think, colloquial ways we talk about food and health and diet, but that can often be really damaging. So I urge you to first just start to identify when you hear people talking and reinforcing that diet culture and those kind of backhanded compliments. The other thing I challenge you to do from there, if you start to feel more comfortable, is to really talk yourself, like first it's just identifying, then it's the talking yourself out of really hearing and tapping in and listening to it. How do you identify that type of language as going against the food freedom mindset? And then with those people you feel comfortable with, you feel like engaging in conversations with, try and educate them gently about how that kind of talk is a little damaging and can really encourage some negative mindsets. You don't have to be aggressive, and you don't have to be, tell them what's what, but it's important. And I think it really spreads this more positive message of, health status not being attributed to weight, and a healthy diet that is traditional is not the only healthy diet out there. Strategy 5 would be to remember the average. So I talked about this in one of my last episodes. Essentially, diet culture kind of encouraged to spike up and down. So you have a spike up and down of weight status. You have a spike up and down of eating healthy, eating maybe more unhealthy. A spike up and down of motivation and discouragement. All these things that are spiking up and down so viciously because of the type of cycle and how it encourages it. Whereas with food freedom, you have a little bit more of a nice smooth curve because you're not encouraging those extremes on either end. Here's a good visual to kind of explain that trend. So we have on the left side, the clean sheet cycle, where you hear people say, I ate so healthy during the week and then I messed it all up on the weekend and I just ate like crap all weekend. And so, of course, this is just a generalization using graphics. These are not reflective of what someone would eat during the day. But just generally, you have vegetables and tea and fruits all throughout the day, Monday to Friday. And on the weekend, you're eating some of those like traditionally unhealthy foods in excess. Okay, so if you see on the left side, average is 10 cheat meals. On the right side, with what I'm encouraging with this food freedom piece, I'm encouraging that you don't need to restrict yourself during the week and then fall into that binge cycle on the weekend. Just give yourself those foods that you see as unhealthy throughout the week. You don't need a special occasion for them. They are food just like the vegetables and the fruits, and they have a place within a healthy diet. And some days, maybe you eat that perfectly clean, healthy day, and other days you have maybe more than one of those like unhealthy items. But ultimately, if you count up the unhealthier items, the average is 6. So in letting yourself indulge throughout the week, it kind of just naturally brings down those incidences of bad behaviors. And I don't like to label them as good or bad, but I think it's important to see that when you categorize them as good and bad, you don't like save them for a special occasion. You just normalize them. They just become part of your day. They just become part of your week, your month, your year, your lifetime. And last, this one's kind of short and sweet, but I think it's important, and I think you need to practice every day with positive self-talk and affirmation. This is a practice, and you need motivation, and you need to encourage yourself to keep going. And you deserve to live a life and eat a diet free of guilt and restriction. So start telling yourself that, and start affirming the behaviors in which you are able to be more forgiving and be more flexible. Be proud of yourself for trying to shift a mindset, because it's not easy. Be proud of yourself for indulging. Be proud of yourself for having a really healthy week. Be proud of yourself for feeling good and for making strides in your health goals. And remind yourself all the time, just do it. So I give you these pieces of advice, but I have to just acknowledge that this is a challenging mindset for a lot of reasons. So first, this mindset is not new. The diet culture mindset, The diet culture mindset is not new. It's been ingrained in us for decades, and it used to be way worse. It's not going to be easy to wash that away at all. I think we didn't know better for a really long time, and now we know better. We know how to acknowledge some of that negative mindset and how it's affecting us long term. But it's not going to be easy. And it's not our fault either for having subscribed to that in the past or in the future. It's not our fault. It's part of the way that society kind of is, unfortunately. Also, relationships with food are they're just complex. Your relationship with food can be emotional. It can be in pertinence to your mental health. There might be physical triggers that affect your relationship with food. This is very complex. And alongside of that, weight status and size and your relationship with that is very complex. Again, this is something that's been ingrained in our culture for a long time. That size is indicative of health, and that, especially women should eat less or eat healthier. It's something that's not easy to just talk yourself out of. And so with that being said, I can't give anyone the recommendation or the guidance to battle with these complex issues over this webinar series. This is not a super personal one-to-one medium. Now, as a dietitian, I'm able to speak to that. So if anybody ever needs guidance or, someone to help them move forward away from these issues, I am 100% there for you and would love to chat. Please reach out. But in this setting today, I just need to acknowledge that it's a complex issue and not easy to overcome. And then last, this is probably the most significant one that I get from people. Slow progress, though still progress, is discouraging. It is, and instant gratification, I didn't finish that, sorry. But what I was going to say is instant gratification is so much more appealing. And so we go for those things. But ultimately, I still believe that the slow progress is so much, has better effects long-term. Though I understand and I acknowledge how that slow progress can be discouraging. I mean, just personally, I'm trying to start a business and it's a very slow growing process. And I have days where I get really frustrated by how slow it is. But ultimately, I need to follow my own advice and just kind of hang in there. So I acknowledge it is challenging. So how do we battle these obstacles? How do we move past them? Again, I'm going to say it again, practice. But this is why I'm creating this webinar series. I want to introduce these mindsets, the intuitive eating, that framework that helps us really identify our kind of guiding principles towards how we should interact and utilize food. Into mindful eating, these tools that we can use to really slow down and tune in, because tuning in ultimately is going to help us question those things that I just talked about in the last slide, those barriers that come up. Start questioning them. Why do I feel this way? Why is this so complex? Why is our society ingraining these mindsets in us and the way that we behave in our food choice and our pursuit for a certain number on the scale? And last, using these strategies to support this overall shift. Understand the framework, start to tune in, and then use the strategies to help you practice that tune-in piece. That's how I propose overcoming those barriers. And I say we start now. So I want to just have everyone pull out a pen and paper or the Notes app on your phone or your computer. And I want you to either start thinking about these questions and write them down as a commitment to your first step in this process towards shifting your mindset. Or even if you think it's more complex and you start thinking about it, just start thinking about these questions in pertinence to your commitment to this shift. So question number one, what is one way in which you can allow yourself more flexibility in your diet? Number two, what is one reminder you can fall back on when you need to practice forgiveness? Kind of going back to those affirmations. How do you use those affirmations to give yourself forgiveness? when you're feeling a certain way about food and choice. And last, what is one benefit that you see for yourself in adopting these sustainable health practices? How do you see your life changing from adopting a mindset like this? So now I will give you time to think. If you would like to continue this, the writing down or thinking about these questions, please feel free to do that. If you would like to discuss them in the next Q&A session, I would be happy to hear your thoughts and we can talk about them. If you have questions about anything I suggested in this episode, I'd love to hear them. So with that being said, I'll kind of open the floor now, and if anybody has anything to share or ask, I'm here for it. And thank you so much again for joining. I really appreciate everyone joining in today. I'm excited for my last episode next week on Thursday, 7 o'clock. And next week will be a little bit more talking about weight bias and what we call HAES, or health at every size. And so I'm really excited because it'll be a little bit more of challenging that kind of societal pressure, the kind of ingrained societal piece of diet culture and everything it brings. So thank you guys. I hope you have all a good night.